Fear does not arrive suddenly in the barracks, it accumulates. It seeps in through the cracks long before anyone consciously acknowledges it, settling into the air until it becomes indistinguishable from the stale smell of sweat, damp fabric, and unwashed bodies. By the time the men recognize it, fear is already everywhere, embedded in the walls, pressed into the wooden bunks, hovering just above the floor like a low fog. It is not the sharp fear of immediate violence, but something heavier and more corrosive, the fear of waiting, of not knowing, of being powerless inside a system that has already decided your worth. The barracks itself feels smaller than it should. Its dimensions are ordinary, but fear compresses space. The ceiling seems lower, the walls closer together, as if the room is slowly tightening around its occupants. Light enters reluctantly, filtered through grimy windows that soften daylight into a dull, colorless haze. Nothing here feels temporary, even though everything is. The men understand, without speaking, that this room is not a destination but a pause, a holding place between identities, between past lives and an unknown future that no longer belongs to them. Silence dominates, but it is not calm. It vibrates with suppressed tension, broken only by involuntary sounds. A cough that comes too loud, boots shifting on the floor, the creak of wood under redistributed weight. Each noise feels like a mistake, an announcement of vulnerability. Conversations have ended not because there is nothing to say, but because speech feels dangerous. Words could expose fear, and fear feels like weakness. Better to remain still, to blend into the collective presence of men trying not to be seen as individuals. Every face carries its own version of dread. Some men stare straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, as if focus alone can keep panic at bay. Others avoid looking up entirely, studying the floor with exaggerated attention, counting cracks in the wood, tracing old stains left by unknown predecessors. A few glance sideways, cautiously, measuring the emotional state of those around them. There is comfort in knowing fear is shared, but also danger. Panic can spread faster than reassurance ever could. Time behaves strangely here. Minutes stretch and thin until they lose shape, while hours pass unnoticed. The men cannot tell whether they have been here for a short while or much longer than they remember. Hunger comes and goes, fatigue settles into muscles without relief, but fear remains constant, anchoring them in the present. Memory intrudes unpredictably, images of home, of ordinary life before uniforms and orders, but these thoughts are quickly pushed away. Nostalgia is dangerous. It reminds them of what they have already lost. Authority is invisible yet omnipresent. No one needs to see a guard or hear an order for its influence to be felt. The rules of captivity are already understood instinctively: wait, comply, endure. The men know they are being observed, even when no eyes are visible. This awareness sharpens every movement. Hands remain close to bodies, postures stiff, expressions guarded. The body learns fear faster than the mind ever could. There is an unspoken hierarchy within the room, shaped not by rank but by composure. Those who appear calm, whether genuinely or by force of habit, become quiet reference points for the others. Panic isolates, control attracts attention. Yet even the most outwardly composed men feel the same tightening in the chest, the same dull pressure behind the eyes. No one here is immune. Fear equalizes them in a way the war never did. The men understand, perhaps more clearly than ever, how thin the line is between survival and collapse. Fear sharpens awareness but drains strength. It forces the mind to rehearse worst-case scenarios in endless cycles. What will happen next? How long this will last? Whether there will be pain, humiliation, or something worse. Each unanswered question becomes a weight added to the collective burden the room already carries. The barracks holds the residue of previous occupants. Scratches on the walls, worn patches on the floor, bunks smoothed by countless bodies, all silent evidence that others have passed through this space. The men cannot help but wonder where those people went. Some imagine release, others execution, others transfer to places rumored but never seen. The room offers no clues, only the unsettling suggestion that this moment has repeated itself many times before. Fear also alters perception of the self. The men feel themselves shrinking inward, reducing to basic needs and instincts. Ideals that once felt solid, duty, honor, loyalty, become abstract concepts, distant and fragile. In their place emerges a more immediate calculus: how to endure the next hour, the next command, the next unknown development. Survival narrows perspective until it excludes almost everything else. Despite this, there is a quiet resistance embedded within the fear. It is not defiance, but endurance. Each man is still here, still breathing, still upright. That fact alone becomes a small victory, though no one would frame it that way. They are not heroes in this moment. They are witnesses to their own vulnerability. The war has stripped them of illusion, leaving behind a raw awareness of how quickly control can disappear. The air grows heavier as the men continue to wait. Fear feeds on inactivity, amplifying itself in the absence of information. No one knows what will break the stillness, only that it will be broken eventually. Until then, the barracks remains suspended in a fragile equilibrium, held together by silence, shaped by anticipation, and saturated with fear so thick it feels almost tangible. This is the state in which the men exist at the beginning, not yet transformed by what will happen next, but already altered by what they expect to happen. The fear in the barracks is not simply a reaction to captivity. It is a reflection of the war itself, impersonal, consuming, and indifferent to individual lives. And within this atmosphere, every man waits, braced for a future he cannot see, convinced that whatever comes next will confirm his worst assumptions. Expectation shapes fear into something more rigid and more enduring. By the time the men reach this stage of waiting, they are no longer afraid in a general sense. They are afraid in very specific ways. Each man carries a private catalog of anticipated cruelties, assembled from rumors, second-hand stories, propaganda, and imagination sharpened by exhaustion. War has educated them thoroughly in what captivity is supposed to look like, and that education has left little room for hope. Kindness does not feature in these expectations. It feels incompatible with the machinery that brought them here. Their minds work ahead of reality, rehearsing outcomes as a form of grim preparation. If pain is inevitable, better to imagine it first. If humiliation is coming, better to dull its impact by expecting it. This mental conditioning becomes a survival mechanism, even as it corrodes them from the inside. Optimism would be reckless. Trust would be suicidal. In this environment, suspicion feels like wisdom. The men do not simply fear what might happen. They believe they already know what will. This belief influences every interaction, even the absence of interaction. A door opening is not just a sound, it is a signal. Footsteps outside the barracks do not belong to individuals but to roles: guard, interrogator, authority. The men respond not to people but to the meanings assigned to them by war. An enemy uniform carries an entire narrative with it, one that does not allow for nuance or deviation. The expectation of cruelty has flattened complexity into certainty. The men have learned, over months or years, that mercy is unreliable and rare. They have seen how easily violence becomes routine, how quickly ordinary people can be absorbed into systems that reward obedience over compassion. This knowledge hardens into a worldview. It becomes safer to assume the worst than to be caught unprepared by it. Hope, once disappointed, is far more dangerous than despair. So they suppress it deliberately, like a reflex. In the barracks, this mindset becomes collective. No one says it aloud, but it circulates silently among them, reinforcing itself. When one man flinches at a sudden sound, others notice and adjust their own posture. When another lowers his eyes, it confirms the shared assumption that submission is expected. Fear becomes coordinated, synchronized. It creates a fragile order, one maintained not by authority but by anticipation. Memory plays an active role in sustaining this expectation. The men recall earlier moments of capture, previous encounters with power, scenes where kindness was promised and then revoked. Even those who have not experienced direct cruelty carry the inherited memory of it, absorbed through stories and warnings passed from soldier to soldier. War does not require personal experience to teach its lessons. It spreads them efficiently through fear. This expectation also strips the present moment of ambiguity. Everything is interpreted through a lens of threat. A pause before an order feels deliberate, calculated. A neutral expression is assumed to conceal hostility. Silence is never benign. It is read as control, as dominance. The men cannot afford to misread signals, so they err consistently on the side of caution. In doing so, they deny themselves any possibility of surprise that might come in the form of mercy. Their bodies mirror this mental state. Muscles remain tense even when there is no immediate reason to be. Breathing becomes shallow, conserving energy for a reaction that may never be needed. Fatigue accumulates but never fully manifests as rest. Sleep, when it comes, is fragmented and restless, filled with images shaped by expectation rather than memory. Even unconsciousness offers no escape. Within this psychological landscape, individuality recedes further. Personal histories, values, and beliefs are compressed into a single shared identity, captive. The men relate to one another less as distinct people and more as reflections of the same predicament. Empathy exists, but it is muted by self-preservation. To dwell too much on another's fear is to amplify one's own. Emotional distance becomes another protective measure. The expectation of cruelty also redefines dignity. Acts that once would have seemed degrading now feel pragmatic. Avoiding attention becomes a form of intelligence. Silence becomes discipline. Endurance becomes virtue. The men recalibrate their sense of self-worth to align with survival rather than principle. This adaptation is subtle but profound. It reshapes who they believe themselves to be. At the same time, this mindset creates an internal contradiction. By assuming inhumanity from their captors, the men reinforce the very moral division that sustains the war. Enemy becomes synonymous with cruelty, and cruelty becomes proof of enmity. This circular logic leaves no room for deviation. If kindness were to appear, it would not simply be unexpected, it would be destabilizing. It would challenge not just their fear, but the entire framework through which they understand the conflict. Yet the men cannot articulate this vulnerability. They cling to expectation because it provides structure in an otherwise chaotic situation. Knowing what to fear feels preferable to confronting uncertainty. Cruelty, at least, follows recognizable patterns. Kindness would demand recalibration, forcing them to question assumptions that have kept them psychologically intact. As time stretches on, this expectation becomes heavier, more entrenched. It shapes posture, thought, and emotion until it feels inseparable from reality itself. The men are no longer just waiting for something bad to happen, they are living inside the certainty that it will. This belief fills the barracks as completely as fear did before, reinforcing the silence and tightening the collective resolve to endure whatever comes. By the end of this phase, the men are braced not only against physical harm but against disappointment. They have closed themselves off from the possibility of relief, convinced that to hope would be to invite greater suffering. In doing so, they believe they are protecting themselves. They do not yet realize that this certainty, this expectation of cruelty, has prepared them for pain, but not for its absence. When the moment of disruption finally arrives, it does so without fanfare, without announcement or preparation. It enters the barracks quietly, almost invisibly, like a whisper that none of the men quite understand at first. What begins as a simple, unremarkable act, a gesture, an offer, a tone, carries with it the weight of an unexpected possibility. In a room where silence has become a kind of armor, where fear is the language of every interaction, this gesture is a foreign word. It is a signal that defies every expectation, a crack in the armor of certainty that has held the men in its tight grip for so long. The first man to notice does not immediately recognize it for what it is. His senses are attuned to every threat, every sign of aggression. He knows the rhythm of captivity too well, has learned to decipher the subtle cues of impending pain or humiliation. So when kindness enters, it feels foreign, even absurd. It is not the reaction he has trained himself to anticipate, and therefore it is dismissed at first as a fluke, a mistake. He looks around, unsure of what he is seeing, but finds no confirmation from his comrades. Their eyes are locked in the same weary vigilance, scanning for danger, searching for the familiar form of their captors or guards. They too are blind to what is unfolding before them, incapable of seeing beyond the narrow lens through which they have been trained to view the world. It is the tension of the moment that blinds them to what is happening right in front of them. As the seconds pass, the nature of the disruption begins to take root. The men start to feel it, first as a ripple, then as a slow current beneath the surface of their thoughts. The rules they have lived by, the assumptions they have relied upon to keep their fear manageable, are suddenly in question. The suddenness of the act, the way it does not conform to any of their expectations, forces them to re-examine their beliefs, their understanding of the world around them. In a place where brutality has been the defining characteristic of their existence, kindness feels like a violation of the most basic tenet of war, that the enemy is always dehumanized, always stripped of their capacity for mercy. At first, the men do not react. They stand still, locked in that suspended moment of disbelief. Their bodies are frozen, unsure of how to move, how to respond to this foreign element that has invaded their carefully constructed reality. They are trapped in the weight of this surprise, unsure of whether they should be grateful, confused, or even suspicious. It is easier to distrust this act of kindness than to embrace it, because doing so would mean opening the door to a vulnerability they have long since closed off. It would mean acknowledging that there are cracks in the enemy's armor, cracks that they themselves have become afraid to explore. And yet, there is something undeniable about the gesture. The men cannot look away from it, even though they do not fully understand it. It has weight, substance, a power to it that cannot be dismissed, no matter how much they might want to. In the silence that follows, the atmosphere of the room shifts. What was once a space thick with fear, expectation, and survival now holds the tension of something new, something unspoken, but infinitely more dangerous than anything that has come before it. It is the possibility that the world is not as simple as they thought. It is the suggestion that kindness might exist even in the most unlikely places, and with it, the devastating realization that their long-held understanding of the enemy, of the war itself, has been incomplete. For the first time since they arrived in the barracks, the men experience a sense of uncertainty that is not rooted in fear of pain or harm, but in the discomfort of a new emotional terrain. They are now forced to confront a question that has never occurred to them before. What happens when the enemy does not behave as expected? What happens when someone in this room, someone they have been trained to hate and fear, extends the smallest gesture of humanity? Does it change everything, or is it simply a fluke, an anomaly that can be dismissed in the name of survival? They struggle with this new reality in silence, and it is this silence that becomes the loudest sound in the room. It is not a silence of fear, nor is it the quietude of acceptance. It is a silence born of confusion, of the mind struggling to process what has happened. In the face of cruelty, silence is a form of survival. In the face of kindness, it becomes a question, an invitation to consider a world where the rules are not so simple. The men, now aware of this shift, feel their own bodies react to the subtle disturbance. There is a hesitation, a slight loosening in their rigid postures, an unconscious uncurling of muscles held tight for too long. It is not a dramatic change, but it is enough to be noticed. They are unsure whether to lean into this new possibility or to pull back, to hold onto the certainty of their earlier assumptions. But there is something undeniable about the weight of this act, this kindness. It presses against their minds, forcing them to entertain the idea that perhaps they have been wrong all along. Perhaps they have misunderstood not only their captors, but the entire nature of their existence here in the barracks. What follows is not an immediate acceptance of kindness, nor is it a rejection of it. Instead, it is a quiet and profound shift in perspective. The men begin to feel the subtle tremor of a possibility they had never considered, that the lines between enemy and friend are not as clear-cut as they once believed. They realize, too late, that kindness does not negate the brutality they have experienced, but it does challenge their assumptions in ways they are unprepared for. It forces them to reckon with the fact that war has not only created enemies, but has also shaped their own identities in ways they are only beginning to understand. This realization does not come quickly or easily. It settles in slowly, like water dripping onto a stone, over time carving its mark. The men do not know how to respond, nor do they know what to make of this shift. They remain in that moment of suspended disbelief, caught between fear and the unsettling promise of something different. But they can no longer ignore the change in the air, the subtle fracture in their worldview. It is an uncomfortable realization, one that leaves them uncertain about what happens next. For the first time since their capture, the men are forced to confront the deeper, more complex truth of their situation. Survival may not be as simple as enduring. It may also require them to reckon with their own humanity, their own capacity for compassion, even in the face of overwhelming cruelty. And that, perhaps, is the most disorienting part of all. The room, already steeped in a tense silence, falls even quieter in the moments following the unexpected kindness. The air feels thick, as though the very atmosphere itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. The men stand frozen, each locked in his own internal struggle, unable to fully process what has just happened. In this silence, the world outside the barracks, with its chaos and violence, feels distant, almost unreal. It is as if time has momentarily stopped, held in suspension by the weight of what they have just witnessed. This pause, this moment of unspoken acknowledgement, carries with it a new kind of discomfort. It is no longer the discomfort of fear or dread, but something more unsettling, something that reaches deep into the heart of their being. The men are no longer merely waiting for what they fear might happen next. They are now grappling with the dawning realization that their assumptions, the very foundation of their understanding of this war, may no longer hold true. The enemy, in this brief and unexpected moment, has shown them a side of themselves they were not prepared to see. The rules have shifted, and the men are left without a map to navigate this new terrain. They are not sure how to react, nor do they know if they are even allowed to. The kindness, subtle and unassuming though it may have been, has created a ripple effect that touches every one of them. It is as if the walls of the barracks, once so thick with fear, have been slightly parted, allowing the possibility of something else to enter, something human, something that defies the brutal expectations they had carried with them. But the men, unsure of what this means, do not immediately embrace this new possibility. They cannot. The weight of their conditioning is too heavy, too ingrained in their psyches to let go of it so easily. And yet, despite their hesitation, something shifts within them. It is not an immediate change, but a subtle one, a change that they cannot quite name but feel nonetheless. The first crack has appeared in the hardened shell of their expectations, and they cannot ignore it. Each of them experiences this shift in his own way. Some men, whose fear has been their constant companion, feel it as a tightening in their chest, a sense of unease that they cannot place. Others feel it as a stirring of something long buried within them, an awareness of their own humanity, a reminder of the emotions they had suppressed for so long in order to survive. For some, the act of kindness is a source of confusion, a question they cannot yet answer. For others, it is a moment of recognition, a brief flicker of hope that is quickly doused by the overwhelming reality of their situation. But for all of them, the effect is the same. A profound silence has settled over the room, and it is a silence that cannot be easily dispelled. It is a silence not born of fear or uncertainty, but of something deeper, something more difficult to confront. It is the silence of a mind struggling to reconcile what it has seen with what it has known. It is the silence of a heart unsure of how to respond when the world has revealed itself to be more complicated than expected. And yet, despite the silence, the room is no longer as it was. The oppressive atmosphere that once clung to every corner, every crevice, has been altered, if only slightly. The men still stand in formation, still maintain the rigid postures they have been trained to hold, but there is a shift in the way they breathe, in the way they move, in the way they look at each other. It is not a dramatic change, not an immediate transformation, but it is there, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. This shift creates a palpable tension in the air, a tension that is neither positive nor negative, but simply exists. It is the tension of the unknown, of the men standing at the edge of something they do not fully understand. It is a tension that speaks to the complexity of human nature, to the struggle between survival and compassion, between fear and hope. The men are caught between these forces, unsure of which one will ultimately win out. The barracks, once a place of cold, impersonal survival, now feels like a stage for something more intimate, more personal. A stage for the quiet battle between the self and the other, between what they have been taught to fear and what they have just witnessed. As the minutes stretch on, the silence becomes heavier. It is no longer just the absence of sound, it is the weight of an unspoken truth that hangs over them all. They cannot ignore what has happened, cannot pretend that it has not affected them. It is there, lingering in the corners of their minds, forcing them to confront a reality they have been avoiding for so long. They are not simply prisoners in a war, they are human beings, capable of compassion, of empathy, of something more than just survival. This realization is both a relief and a burden, for it challenges everything they thought they knew about themselves, about each other, and about the war that has brought them to this point. For some, this shift brings with it a sense of unease, a discomfort with the idea that the enemy, the very force they have been taught to despise, could show them kindness. It feels like a betrayal of everything they have held onto for so long. They had built their identities around the certainty of their roles, soldiers, captives, enemies, but now that certainty is crumbling. They are no longer just enemies and allies. They are human beings, caught in a moment of moral complexity that they are ill-equipped to navigate. But for others, the shift is more profound. They feel a stirring of something that has long been buried. A recognition that they are capable of something more than survival, that they are capable of something greater than fear. In this moment, kindness becomes not just an act but a mirror, reflecting back to them a version of themselves they had forgotten, a version that exists beyond the confines of war and violence. They do not know yet what this means, but they can feel the weight of it, pressing on them, urging them to confront the possibilities it opens up. In the end, the silence in the barracks is not broken by words or action, but by the realization that something has changed. The men do not know how to navigate this new reality, but they cannot ignore it. They are left to sit with the discomfort of their own humanity, to confront the complexities of war and compassion, of fear and kindness, and to wonder, perhaps for the first time, what it means to be human in a world defined by violence and survival. This silence, heavy and profound, will not be easily forgotten, for it is the moment when the walls of their understanding begin to crumble, leaving them to face a world far more complicated than they could have ever imagined. As the men stand in the barracks, suspended in the weight of their collective silence, something begins to stir within them, a subtle shift that they cannot yet fully grasp, but feel nonetheless. The kindness that has been offered to them, though brief and unremarkable on the surface, has begun to work its way into the fabric of their consciousness. It is not the dramatic change they might have expected, nor does it offer any clear path forward. Instead, it creates an internal dissonance that is far more unsettling. The certainty that had once defined their lives, their expectations of cruelty, of humiliation, of survival through fear, has been cracked open, leaving behind a strange, uncomfortable void. The men do not know how to fill this space, but they feel its presence all the same. It is the recognition that they have been wrong about something, perhaps many things, and they do not yet understand how this new knowledge will affect them. In the moments following the kindness, the men are left in a quiet limbo. The fear that once gripped them so tightly now feels distant, not because it is no longer a threat, but because something has shifted within them. It is as if they have been shown a different way of existing, one that does not rely solely on the dynamics of power, control, and cruelty. The idea that there could be kindness in this place, in this war, is so foreign to them that they cannot yet accept it fully. And yet, the possibility lingers. It hangs in the air, unspoken, but undeniable. Some men feel it more acutely than others. For some, the realization is disorienting. It forces them to confront a part of themselves that they have kept buried for so long. They have built their lives, their identities, on the understanding that to be human in this war is to be ruthless, to survive at any cost. To allow themselves to feel anything else, compassion, empathy, kindness, would be to weaken themselves, to risk everything they have fought for. But now, in this moment, that very foundation is crumbling. They feel vulnerable, exposed, as if something essential about their identity has been laid bare in the face of this kindness. It is not enough to break them, but it is enough to make them question the very framework of survival that they have clung to for so long. Others, however, are not as deeply affected. They feel the kindness, but they cannot yet bring themselves to trust it. It is too easily dismissed, too easily explained away as a one-off, an anomaly that does not change the reality of their situation. They continue to hold on to their fear, their suspicion, because it is safer that way. To acknowledge the possibility of something other than cruelty would be to expose themselves to further disappointment, to further betrayal. It is easier to remain in the world they know, the world of survival through vigilance, where every act is measured by the threat it poses. Kindness, they believe, cannot exist here, and if it does, it is surely fleeting, incapable of withstanding the harsh realities of war. But for those who allow themselves to entertain the idea that kindness might be real, the change is profound. The men begin to reflect, however subtly, on the implications of this moment. They begin to question the nature of their captors, of the enemy they have been taught to despise. For the first time, they entertain the thought that the men on the other side of this conflict are not mere automatons, driven only by orders and violence. They are human, too, capable of emotions, of complexities, of mercy. This is a dangerous thought, one that shakes the very foundation of everything the men have believed in. It is a thought that challenges the binary logic of war, enemy versus ally, good versus evil, that they have relied on for so long. This internal conflict is not easily resolved. It cannot be neatly tucked away or dismissed as an aberration. It forces the men to reckon with the moral ambiguity of their situation, and that reckoning is both unsettling and liberating. It forces them to confront the possibility that they have been dehumanizing not just their captors, but themselves. For so long, they have survived by shutting off the parts of themselves that can feel, that can empathize. They have convinced themselves that to remain human in this war is to be weak, to be vulnerable. But now, in the face of unexpected kindness, they are confronted with the uncomfortable reality that survival, in the truest sense, is not just about enduring brutality. It is also about holding on to the capacity for humanity in a world that constantly tries to strip it away. The barracks, once a place defined by fear, begins to feel different. It is still a place of waiting, of uncertainty, but now there is an undercurrent of something else. It is not yet hope, not yet peace, but it is a subtle shift towards something more complex. The men begin to see each other differently, not as mere prisoners or enemies, but as fellow human beings, each struggling to survive in a world that seems to have lost all sense of moral clarity. They do not yet know what this means for them, but they begin to feel the stirrings of something that transcends the binaries of war. It is a recognition that their survival is not just about outlasting their captors, but about holding on to the very thing that makes them human. This shift does not happen overnight, and it does not happen in unison. The men are not suddenly transformed into paragons of compassion. They do not immediately embrace the idea of kindness or forgiveness. The war and the fear that comes with it is still very real. But the possibility that kindness exists, however fleeting, however unexpected, has altered their perception. They begin to understand that the conflict is not as simple as they once thought. It is not just a battle between nations, between ideologies, between armies. It is a battle for the soul of humanity itself. The men are left with a difficult choice. They can choose to cling to the certainty of their fear, to continue to see the enemy through the narrow lens of violence and hate, or they can allow themselves to entertain the uncomfortable possibility that there is more to this war than what they have been taught. The choice is not an easy one, for it means confronting the very nature of survival itself. It means acknowledging that to survive this war, they must also survive themselves, that to endure the brutality of their captors, they must also be willing to acknowledge the humanity that exists within them. And so they wait. But they do not wait the same way they did before. The silence in the barracks has changed. It is no longer just the silence of fear. It is the silence of possibility. And as the men stand in that silence, they realize, perhaps for the first time, that survival is not just about outlasting the enemy. It is about holding on to what it means to be human, even in the darkest of circumstances. And that realization, though uncomfortable and difficult, begins to shape the men in ways they cannot yet fully understand. The men remain in the barracks, their eyes avoiding one another, their minds locked in private struggles, but the silence between them is no longer the same. There is a shift, a heaviness that hangs in the air, not unlike the silence that came before the first act of unexpected kindness, but this time, it is more complex. The room, once defined by tension, fear, and an almost mechanical understanding of survival, now carries something else, something harder to define but unmistakably present. It is as though the walls themselves have absorbed the quiet stirrings of change, and in their stillness, they echo with the unspoken truths that the men have been too afraid to confront until now. This silence is no longer only the absence of noise. It is filled with the weight of new awareness, of recognition that things cannot go back to the way they were. The kindness that entered their lives like a brief but powerful storm has left a lasting imprint, and though none of them knows how to respond to it yet, it has begun to ripple through them, slowly but steadily. The men feel it in their bodies first, the small, almost imperceptible shifts in posture, the way their shoulders no longer remain as tight, the way their breaths come a little easier than before, though they are still haunted by the echo of the past. They are not free of fear, but it is not as suffocating as it once was. They are not free of doubt, but the possibility of something else has been introduced, and it is difficult to simply ignore it. Each of the men is left to grapple with this new reality in his own way. For some, the realization is like a slow awakening, a gradual lifting of the veil that had obscured their understanding of who they are and why they have endured so much. They realize that survival, the raw, primal need to stay alive, is not the end of the story. It is a beginning, a starting point. But survival, in its most stripped-down form, cannot explain the complexity of what they are feeling now. They have endured countless hardships, fought through unimaginable pain, and survived horrors that should have broken them, and yet, they have come to see that perhaps their survival is not the point. The point is the humanity they have clung to in spite of everything, the ability to feel, to hope, to question, to acknowledge that the world is not divided into black and white, into enemy and ally. There are shades of gray, places where the lines blur and where even the enemy can show kindness. And in this realization, they must decide what it means to remain human in a world that has tested them to their limits.